Hey, my name is Pastor Corey, and I get to be the lead pastor here at Westwinds. And if I've never met you before, I really would love to at least get your name today. I'll be hanging out in the lobby after. I'd love to shake your hand, say hello, and say a happy Easter to you. Now, I just introduced myself, and I told you my name. So now I'd like you to introduce yourself to me, if you don't mind. The count of three, would you tell me your name? 1, 2, 3. Okay, great, got that. And it's appropriate in our culture when you meet somebody, you say, "What's your name?" What's the next question you typically ask them? What do you do? What do you do? Okay, on the count of three, would you tell me what you do? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, why do we ask that question to each other? Anybody know? Okay, I'll at least confess. I want to size you up, you know? Like, I want to know if you're more important than me. I want to know if you've got more education than me. I want to know if you make more money than me. Can I just say it, right? Right? We do this thing in our culture where we ask somebody what they do for work, and then we flatten their identity to that meaning a whole bunch of other stuff. Right? Are we in the same kind of people? Are we the same class of people? Or we live in the same kind of neighborhood? Do we do the same kind of work? Right? We build these identities on other people based on what they do. Some of us have felt this before. If you've ever lost your job, you feel it the other way, right? Someone asks you what you do, and you got to be like, "Oh, I'm out of work right now," and you feel it a little bit of that shame. It's inside of you. We kind of build these structures of identities and value based on what we do or what we don't do. This is not just an American thing. Yeah, this has been like a part of culture for a really long time. In fact, people now for thousands of years have been trying to place themselves against other people to try and figure out, where do I fit inside of this social order? It's actually all throughout the Gospels. It's all throughout the Scriptures. The Gospel writers often will tell you like an indicator about somebody because they want the reader to know where they fit in the social order. Our text today interacts with this some. John chapter 21 tells the story post-resurrection. So Jesus has resurrected from the dead, and he's traveling around. He's finding his disciples wherever they may be and meeting with them post-resurrection. John chapter 21 is one of those meetings. John chapter 21 opens up with the word later, meaning later, after the resurrection. After that event happened, later, Jesus himself appeared again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. John, the author of this book, says this is how it happened. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter told them, "I'm going fishing. I'm going fishing." This is a really important line in this story. If you had known the story of the Gospels, and you know the story of Simon Peter, his story with Jesus started while he was fishing. Peter was fishing one day, and Jesus came to him and said, "I want you to come and follow me." Now, if you go back and find that story, most clearly in the book of Matthew, in there is a really clear statement of one of these indicating labels. The author of Matthew writes, "For they were fishermen." He wants you to know who they were and have you begin to build an identity of Jesus calling them off the water. We'll get to more of that in a minute. They were fishing. They said, the other disciples that were there that day said, "Well, we'll go with you then, man." They set out on a boat, and throughout the night, they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. Jesus called to them, "Children, have you caught anything to eat?" They answered him, "No." He said, "Well, cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they did, and there were so many fish that they couldn't haul the net in. This is a small way in which the author here, John, is beginning to tell a story about abundance. See, before they knew Jesus, they were fishermen, and they fished all the time. I don't think this was Jesus, a more, experienced fisherman saying, "Oh, no. You just got to put the net on the other side. Now, there's a lesson here that they've gone out in the boat in the name of scarcity, right? They thought they lost. They thought the last 3 years of their life were a waste. That everything they believed in, everything they trusted in had failed them, and so they're back fishing. They faced death, and their mindset now was stuck in scarcity. It's done. And so when Jesus first approaches them, he says, no. Death was not the end of the story. Put your net on the other side of the boat. Let me show you the abundance of life that's ahead of us. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. The disciples throughout the Gospels are always trying to place themselves in importance against each other. We'll talk about that more in a minute. John, the author of this Gospel, I've talked about this a couple weeks ago, but he refers to himself in his own Gospel as the one whom Jesus loved, okay? He's writing this book. He said, there's 12 of us. Rather than saying like what I saw, he said, well, the one whom Jesus loved. Himself, right? And he's always kind of placing himself up against Peter. So Peter in the early church, when these stories were being circulated, Peter was he was the leader in the early church. He was the head guy. He was the most important one. He'd walk into a room and people would have reverence. They'd listen to him like he was the one in charge. And so when John is writing his story, there's a couple things he wants you to know. He's saying, well, when Jesus was here, I was the one who was loved. And he also wants you to know that it wasn't Peter who recognized that it was the Lord on the shore. It was who? It was John. And the only reason John wants you to know that Peter knew that was Jesus was why? Because I told him. Yeah, I told him that was Jesus, yeah. So when Simon Peter heard that it was Lord, he wrapped a coat around himself for he was naked. Again, I don't know about the fishing practices of that day. He wraps himself, he jumps in the water, and the other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. John wants you to know that one of the disciples ditched out on the work early. Peter, yeah. Peter just went to shore while the rest of us hauled these fish into shore, for they weren't far from shore, only about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw the fire there with the fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you've just caught. Simon Peter got up and pulled the net into shore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. Yet the net hadn't torn, even with so many fish. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast with me. None of the disciples could bring themselves to even ask, who are you? But they knew it was the Lord, John says. Jesus came, he took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. Jesus, in this moment on the beach, is really beginning to disrupt the deep-seated identities that these disciples had. We talked about the beginning of the story where they were labeled as fishermen. To be a fisherman at this time, it came with cultural implications. If you were a fisherman, it meant your family was of low class, like probably low class. Nobody wanted to be around smelly fish all day, every day in this society. It likely meant you were lowly educated, that your education was not as many as others. The story here of these fishermen being invited to follow Jesus is the story of Jesus calling them out of this societal label they wore that they would be unqualified to do anything much more than fish. At the beginning of John's gospel, he tells the story of Jesus' birth and Jesus being Messiah, proclaiming that. And maybe you've heard this statement before, but someone spoke up about this story and there's no way this guy is Messiah. There's no way this is the one we've been waiting for. Why? Well, because he's from Nazareth. And nothing good comes from Nazareth. We get this, right? We're from Jackson. We're not from Ann Arbor or Lansing, where all those educated folks are. They'd be like, no way that person did that thing because they're from Jackson. Nothing good comes from Nazareth, this lame town that Jesus came from. One of Jesus's first interactions with someone outside the disciples was this woman at a well one day where he's sharing a well with this woman. And the story is really clearly wanting you to know this is not just any woman, it's a Samaritan woman. Samaritans came with this label of being unworthy of God because Samaritans were half Jews. They weren't fully God's people. They were a mix. And so they were unworthy. And Jesus on this day restores value to this woman. He undermines the implications of this cultural label. Jesus is doing this over and over and over again in the Gospels. Now this is something we do many, many years later, right? Like we're still living in this society, in this way of being human where we're marking ourselves up against people, like this scarcity of I can't go on if I don't know where I fit in this society. Actually, this lives in a global level as well, a global ethicist, like a guy named Garrett Hardin. In 1970, Garrett Hardin, he coined this way of doing ethics. It's called lifeboat ethics. And what Garrett Hardin was trying to do was trying to help the world grapple with why are there some wealthy nations and then why are there some impoverished nations? I mean, why do some nations of people like ours have so much abundance while there are other nations of people who are literally dying of basic needs? Now, Garrett Hardin's ethical take on this was a little bit controversial. He said, the world is a set of lifeboats with limited capacity. See, the wealthy nations are already on a lifeboat, while those other nations are in the water. And he argued ethically that the moral thing to do, the most moral thing these wealthy nations can do is to protect their own boat from the people dying in the water. That he argued it would actually be immoral to help those others in the water through the abundance of your nation, that your nation must be protected. You got to protect your boat. You can understand why this was a bit of a controversial take. But it hits us somewhere inside of us, right? Actually, if we were, this was like ethics one-on-one in college, okay? I want to invite you into a classroom here for a second. Here's how we would teach young people to wrestle through the ethics of things like this. Sometimes this is called a lifeboat dilemma or a moral triage case. We're going to do one here in the room, okay? Here's the deal. There's a lifeboat. And it can only hold 5 people. The issue is there are 6 people on board. If nobody leaves the lifeboat, everyone dies. Everyone dies. One person must go. And since we're in Ethics 101 right now, you have to choose who you're throwing out of the boat. Okay, now let me raise the stakes a little bit. Okay, we're going to do this together, okay? Prepare your hearts, okay? We're going to raise the stakes a little bit. Here are the people on the boat. There's a 10-year-old child. There's a pregnant woman. There's a doctor on boat. There's a 70-year-old grandmother. There's a single parent with 3 young kids. And there's a construction worker who's very able-bodied, could really row for a long time. So what I'm going to do is I want you to talk to the person next to you. And just to make this a little bit easier, I got pictures of everybody. Okay? Okay, so I'm gonna give you about 30 seconds. I want you to ask the person next to you, who are you throwing off the boat and why? Make them say why, okay? Go ahead, you got 30 seconds, go. Yep. No cop-outs out there. Don't dodge this. We got to make a decision. Someone's got to go or we're all going down. All right, okay, that's good. That's enough ethics for one day. Okay, who's willing to say who they picked and why? We got one all the way in the back. Say nice and loud.
We voted grandma. Like, you can't throw a kid overboard. The doctor's going to be helpful if you get into a health situation.
Okay.
Workers actively helping you out.
So grandma's out.
You can't throw a pregnant lady, and a single parent is already doing the best they can.
Have we lost all honor in the world? We're throwing grandma overboard. Anybody pick someone different? Yeah.
I picked a construction worker because I feel like he's strong and he wouldn't have to.
He's got a chance. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay. Okay. Anybody pick someone different? Yeah, back there. Yeah.
As grandmother, I would volunteer as tribute.
Volunteers tribute. Okay. All right. We got someone copped out over there, right? But isn't this, I mean, the thing with lifeboat ethics is it's meant to kind of help illuminate your mind and your heart and your life on how we do this all the time, even with this something as simple as like, hey, what do you do? Right? I remember when my son, he was about 2 years old, and my wife was pregnant with our daughter, and we were traveling. And I don't know if any of you are in that season of life or remember this season of life, but when you are traveling with kids, you have so much stuff, right? It's just, you have to bring everything with you, right? So we had these like 2 rolly bags that I had I wanted to be a good husband, a good father, and so I'm gonna take care of the luggage and get my son inside while my wife is kind of getting out of the car and getting her stuff together. And so I got both rolly bags together, and then I got like the kid's bag in the middle, and I put up the handles. I'm like, this is a good construction right here. Like, I put engineered this whole contraption, and then I got the car seat, the empty car seat in one hand. Back then, car seats were like heavy. Have you seen these car seats today? You parents don't know what it's like. Anyway, and then to my son, I wanted him to have a great time, because I'm a great dad, so I got him on top, right? And I got this we got this truck going through the airport. Blah, 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 blah. He's laughing and having a great time until I hit the crack in the cement. And he comes over the top and nails his head on the concrete floor. Yeah, that's what everyone in the airport did, right? Everybody is looking at me, and there's 70-year-old grandmothers everywhere giving me those eyes of shame. You know what I'm saying? Right? They're like staring at me. And to be really honest, I grew up playing hockey, me and my friends, we all got a couple concussions. We're okay. We mostly turned out fine. And if I'm being really, really honest, what I was most concerned about was not the brain of my child, was what all of these people thought about me. What I was most concerned about, deep down, if I'm being really honest, in my head, I'm a good parent. And I wanted to say, just stay there for a second, Charlie. I'm a good parent, everybody. You should have saw me yesterday. I had a great day as a father yesterday, right? But these moments that we live under, it's so easy to flatten somebody down to one event or one thing they do or a certain way they look or a certain job they have. And Jesus is upending this over and over and over again in the Gospels with his grace. And he does this not just with words, but with his actions. And his primary tool for doing this was the table. He was constantly getting in trouble with people because who he was willing to spend time with around the table. The religious people of the day felt like, Jesus was offensive because he was eating and spending time at the table with people that they deemed to be sinners. That the religious people of the day and some of the Jewish folks, they were really offended by Jesus and who he showed hospitality towards, because he showed hospitality towards tax collectors. They were like these slimy government workers who took advantage of people on the ground. Some of you might remember a story that we shared a couple weeks ago about how some of actually the lower class people were really offended when Jesus accepted the hospitality of this guy named Zacchaeus. Because Zacchaeus had spent his life taking advantage of the underserved. And Jesus sat at a table with him, and that really, really caused people to be upset with Jesus. Even among the disciples, it was around the table where they would argue about, which one of us, though, is the greatest? I know he invited us all here, but one of us is the greatest. We had to figure out what order we go in Jesus' hierarchy. They'd even argue about who got to sit closest to Jesus or who would be in charge in the future about which one Jesus might have loved the most. You see it? Like even among Jesus's closest followers, this existed. And this is why the church now, for like a couple thousand years, has had this common practice of the table, that we gather at the table because still thousands of years later, we need to be reminded that the grace of God, that the resurrection life of Jesus is not just for some people. It's not just for those people, but it's for anyone, that anyone who would like to receive the hospitality of Jesus, who'd like to receive the grace of God, not all cleaned up or propped up or with your projected cultural identity, but exactly as you are, you're invited to the table of Jesus. And so we're on the beach in this story. And these disciples, man, they had really struggled. Like if you read through the Gospels, this was a really difficult concept for them to understand. They were always wrestling with the kinds of people that Jesus was gracious towards, or that he sat with at tables, that he offered mercy to, the kinds of people he set free or that he healed. They were all the kinds of people he fed. They were always wrestling with like, why them, Jesus? Why them? And this day on the beach, their eyes were opened post-resurrection. The scarcity of death was removed, and they begin to see the abundance of life that comes in the resurrected Jesus. See, for them, they had just days earlier been like debating among them about who was the most faithful among them. And when faced with death, they found that actually they were unfaithful. It was just days earlier that they were like propping themselves up to Jesus about their loyalty. Jesus, like I won't deny you. I'll never betray you. I'm loyal to you. In the face of death, well, they found out they in fact were disloyal to Jesus. These disciples just days earlier were proclaiming to Jesus how courageous they would be. That when things got hard, when things got really hard, that they would be the ones who stood by his side. But in the face of death, they weren't courageous, but they showed that they were fearful. It was these disciples who I think thought of themselves as being so trusting of Jesus, that in the face of death, where did they go? But back fishing. They put their trust in who they were before they encountered Jesus. See, what the cross did, what death did for these disciples, is it revealed some of the worst part of their identities, the parts of themselves that felt like the closest to death. The cross really peeled away these identity markers that we all live in and put on to hide ourselves, to protect the shame that might be in our hearts. And for the disciples, while they had struggled their whole time with Jesus about how other people received grace, this day on the beach, their eyes were open. Why? Because it was them who needed it. It was them that were full of shame. It was them who couldn't hide behind these identities any longer. And their eyes were open to the abundance that comes in life and resurrection, as Jesus met them in the parts that were closest to death and revealed to them that the story of grace is not about death, but it proclaims life and resurrection. I don't know, like, kind of your upbringing, but this is not how grace was explained to me. You know, when I grew up, and some of you could finish this sentence, right? Someone would be talking about grace, and inevitably the line was coming that would be like, if you died tonight, what's next? Do you know where you go? The whole thing was about fear of death. But that's not the story. The resurrection story is about a proclamation of life. It's about an abundance that overcomes the scarcity of death. It's about life available to anyone. It's about life in the parts of you that are closest to death. And here is Jesus on the beach that day, inviting the disciples as they are to his table. And here is Jesus today on this Easter Sunday doing the same for us, inviting us to proclaim the power of resurrection, the power of life by receiving the hospitality of Jesus. In a few moments here, I'm gonna invite anyone who would like to take communion with us. And I just wanna be clear about this, is that at Westwinds, we practice an open table. Here's what we say, that this is Jesus' table. We literally believe that this is a tradition Jesus started and passed it on to us through the generations. And so we say that this is Jesus' table. And if you'd like to be here, he would love to have you. Now I want to say, I recognize that for some of us, that's maybe a controversial statement, or a statement that brings a little tension in your heart because someone told you you couldn't take communion for some reason. Or the way you've understood Jesus up to this point is that, like, for you to go to church or be a part of the church or begin to follow Jesus, you got to take care of some stuff first. And I just want to say the reminder of resurrection is that's not true. That Jesus would love to have you at his table if that's something you long for and want today. So I'm actually going to take this a step further. Is that if today would be your first communion, or your first communion in a long time, I actually want to give you an opportunity. This is not going to feel like an opportunity. That's a nice way of saying, I actually want you to lead us. If today would be your first communion or your first communion in a long time, I want to invite you in a minute to the table first to mark this moment. I never want you to forget that on this Easter Sunday, you were met with the hospitality of God through the table of Jesus, because death is not the winner. Life is the winner. The other reason I want to invite you to come first is because there's a few of us in the room that have been Christians for a while, and we forget about grace. You know that? That we get caught up in all of this identity markering, that we often find ourselves just like the disciples, shaping people up based on what we think makes them valuable or not valuable. What was really interesting about the Christian faith is that its purest moment is when it starts. That you actually don't move through life and get to a more pure version of Christianity. The purest moment is at the inception of it in your life. The first time that you come to Jesus as you are and you experience the grace of Jesus. And then from there, what it's meant to be is for the rest of your life, you work out what that grace means in the rest of my life. And as the world, as the lives we live and as seasons of life go on and on and on, and we pick up these labels and the identities and we hide and we hide and we hide, we come to the table and are reminded about this first grace that we once received. We must come back to again and again and again, that this story is about resurrection and life for anyone. And so I'm going to pray for us. And then when I'm finished praying, I'm going to invite anybody that would like to come and be a part of their first communion or their first communion in a long time to come and meet me at this table. And I won't make you stand here by yourself for very long, I promise. I would just like to serve you the bread. And then when I serve you the bread, you'll be able to go to the common table and dip, and everyone else will come behind you and come to the table right behind you. Fair enough? Okay, let's pray. God, I thank you that this story doesn't end with death. Man, like, even if it did end with death, the story would still be compelling. You know, this man gave his life for something he deeply believed in. But it wouldn't have any transformational power in our lives. And so God, today we don't proclaim death. We proclaim life. We don't proclaim death. We proclaim resurrection. We don't trust in death. We trust in resurrection. And so today as we come to the table, I pray for each of us, you'd remind us of that grace. That come as we are grace that we once found you in. That like the disciples on the beach that day, that we too can receive your hospitality, your grace as we are. That we can invite that resurrection life into our lives and watch it work itself out over the remainder of our days. We pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. If today would be your first communion or your first communion in a long time, would you come first and join me up here? Come on up. Anyone else like to come? Hey, so good to have you. This is the body of Christ that's been broken for you and for us. I invite you to lead us today by dipping it in the cup and remembering the grace of God that meets us exactly where we're at today. You take it to the table and dip and eat. Let's join him at the table today.